November 6, 1862. It has been nearly 2 months since the Battle of Antietam at Sharpsburg, Maryland. McClellan has advanced the Army of the Potomac from Sharpsburg to Warrenton, Virginia. The two corps of the Confederate Army are currently divided. Longstreet is in McClellan's front at Culpeper Courthouse. Stonewall Jackson is near Winchester, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. President Lincoln and Congress want decisive action, and patience for McClellan's delay has grown weak. McClellan has not followed through with a decisive action since Antietam, and the number of good marching days is already ending for 1862. On November 7, 1862, General McClellan is relieved of command. Lincoln replaces McClellan with Ambrose Burnside. Burnside will make all haste and turn toward Richmond. He plans to cross the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg and then move on toward the Confederate capital with all speed. On November 14th, Burnside reorganizes the Army of the Potomac. The Army has 6 corps, but these corps will be nested into 3 grand divisions, with 2 corps placed under each grand division. Edwin Sumner will command the Right Grand Division. The Right Grand Division includes the corps under Couch and Wilcox. The Center Grand Division will be under Joseph Hooker. This Grand Division includes the corps under Stoneman and Butterfield. The Left Grand Division will be under William Franklin, which incorporates the corps under Reynolds and Smith. Burnside does what Washington wants. He moves quickly, with his eye set on Richmond. This giant 120,000-man army rolls across the Virginia countryside. In Washington, though, General-in-Chief Henry Halleck has advised Burnside to monitor and pursue Lee along the Blue Ridge Mountains. However, Burnside makes a left face from Warrenton and advances toward Fredericksburg on the Rappahannock River. By November 17th, Sumner's Grand Division is arriving in Falmouth on the Rappahannock River, just across from Fredericksburg. However, the reality of latter November weather is now setting in. Rains are slowing supply trains. Burnside's requests for pontoon bridges to cross the river have not yet arrived at Falmouth. Without pontoon bridges, Burnside cannot cross the river. This 1863 illustration of Fredericksburg shows the city at the time of the battle. We can see that the bridge over the river to William Street and the railroad bridge here had already been destroyed. These bridges were destroyed in a different previous action before the battle in December of 1862. Burnside will need to construct new bridges to cross the Rappahannock River. This illustration shows a number of roads that will be cited, including the Plank Road, which extends from William Street. Hanover Street here leads out to Telegraph Road and Mary's Heights beyond town. A sunken country road, Telegraph Road, shown in white, lines the base of the high ground. In front of the sunken road is open fairgrounds. A mill race water canal crosses here. A railroad swings in toward the river near Hanover Street. This historical view will help us piece together the location of the battle within the modern landscape, which has transformed much since 1862. Burnside's army is forming near Falmouth, waiting for pontoon bridges to arrive. The Rappahannock River is here in blue. Fredericksburg is on the other side of the river here. As each November day passes, Burnside's problems get larger than waiting for pontoon bridges. Indeed, a larger impediment for Burnside is amassing at Fredericksburg. Longstreet's corps has arrived at Fredericksburg by November 21. We will zoom in to Fredericksburg. Now we will rotate the view to face west so it matches the same direction we saw in that hand-drawn illustration. The town today is much larger than the town we saw in the illustration from 1862, but many of the landmarks we noted a few moments ago on the historical drawing are still here, including William Street and Hanover Street. Hanover Street leads out to the sunken road shown in white. Rising beyond the sunken road is Mary's Heights here. The railroad is here. Modern Kenmore Avenue, shown here in blue, was the Mill Race Canal in 1862. What's changed is that the open fairgrounds is now gone. I have colored over the modern development to recreate those open fields that were present in 1862. The sunken road in front of Mary's Heights is highlighted in yellow. The mill race runs through the open fields. Hanover Street, shown in white, is highlighted because it's one of the main roads leading out of town towards the Heights. It is also significant because it has a bridge over the canal and it intersects with the sunken road. This picturesque town, however, was appearing to be the epicenter of a major confrontation as each day in November 1862 passed. Let's take a step back. On the other side of the river, Burnside's Army of the Potomac is finding its own topography to use. The heights lining the river opposite of Fredericksburg are Stafford Heights, high points ready for artillery. Across the Rappahannock on the Fredericksburg side, Longstreet's corps has assembled to defend the town. Longstreet's position is quite stretched north to south, so we will zoom out to get a wider view. Longstreet is stretched across some 6.5 miles from the Rappahannock on his left to Prospect Hill on his right. Mary's Heights are in the center of the line here. Longstreet's divisions from top to bottom are R. H. Anderson, then McLaws with Ransom in reserve, then Pickett, and finally Hood. Hood is on the high ground at Prospect Hill. Longstreet has time to dig in. In addition to forming his artillery along high points on this ridge, his infantry prepare defenses. A stone wall lines the sunken road in front of Mary's Heights here. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Rappahannock at Falmouth, Burnside's pontoon bridges have still not arrived. The mule train carrying the pontoon bridges from Washington suffers equipment, communications, and weather delays, and days turn to weeks. With each passing day, the Confederate Army will add more men and entrenchments to their lines at Fredericksburg. The delay in pontoon bridges has turned Burnside's river crossing into an unexpected large gathering of armies. The ensuing actions at Fredericksburg occur between Antietam and Gettysburg. Fredericksburg will include haunting repeats from Antietam and eerie presages of Gettysburg. Just as Burnside was delayed by a bridge action over Antietam Creek in September, he is again confounded by a bridge action over the Rappahannock. In many ways, Burnside's bridge at Antietam is now magnified at the Rappahannock. Unfortunately for the Army of the Potomac, if Burnside had pontoons at Falmouth on November 20th, the river crossing to Fredericksburg may actually have been a small action, as Stonewall Jackson's corps had not yet arrived on the site. It is conceivable that Burnside's original plan, with pontoons ready at Falmouth in late November, would have successfully secured Fredericksburg, and his giant army might have possibly crippled Longstreet's lone and long-stretched corps there. But the rains continued, and the pontoon train did not arrive. Burnside considered crossing the Rappahannock River at Skinker's Neck, east of Fredericksburg, near Port Royal. However, the roads at Skinker's Neck were poor, and the Confederates had established a defense there. Robert E. Lee knows by November 21 that the entire Army of the Potomac is assembling at Falmouth. On the Union side, Sumner's Grand Division has placed its artillery on Stafford Heights, the long ridge line overlooking Fredericksburg from the far side of the Rappahannock River. Sumner demands that civil authorities in Fredericksburg surrender the city. The townspeople know a battle is looming, and a bombardment may occur imminently. Women and children are encouraged to leave. The town is largely vacated. In the last week of November, Stonewall Jackson moves his corps toward Fredericksburg. Lee's army will soon no longer be divided. It is now December 1862. Burnside's pontoon bridges and engineers have arrived. The crossing can commence. On November 9, Burnside calls his generals to council. His plan is simple. The Grand Divisions under Sumner and Hooker will cross the river and take the town, while Franklin's Grand Division is to cross south of town and secure Prospect Hill. The generals would later recall mixed reactions to this plan. However, Sumner would claim it was practical to take the rebel heights above the town, while others, like Couch, thought the plan was overly rash. Burnside's attack has an intriguing yet fatally flawed logic. He reasons that Lee is likely expecting a movement against one of the crossings up or down river, such as at Skinker's Neck. Burnside is convinced Lee has thus reinforced Port Royal downriver from Fredericksburg. Thus, Burnside believes a direct assault on Fredericksburg would surprise Lee because Lee would not expect such a direct frontal assault. In this case, the Army of the Potomac could separate the rebel force at Fredericksburg from the rebel force at Port Royal. We will zoom in to Fredericksburg. Burnside's plan is coming together. At this stage, he is imagining a two-stroke hit against the rebel line. Like a boxer, Burnside will strike with a left hook against Prospect Hill, followed by a right uppercut against Mary's Heights. This 1-2 strike was to confuse Lee into shifting reinforcements to different sections of the battlefield. The rebel right would be compromised by the fall of Prospect Hill, and then the center rebel line would be severed at the fall of Mary's Heights. Burnside's rashness extends to communications. He sent this plan through telegraph to Washington. General-in-Chief Halleck replied with a message. I beg of you not to telegraph details of your plans nor the times of your intended movements. No secret can be kept which passes through so many hands. Let's look west into Fredericksburg from the Union vantage point across the river. The Union Army will have to advance over 6 obstacles. There is the Rappahannock River, the town itself, the open ground, the mill race, the sunken road reinforced by a stone wall, and then finally the fortified heights themselves. Lee will not attempt to make a stand within town, as Stafford Heights across the river provide the Federals with commanding artillery presence, making a stand in town untenable. Lee will rather have his men on the heights beyond town, and the town will be left to forward sharpshooters. Despite the frontal nature of the advance into Fredericksburg across a water hazard, Burnside does have one advantage. It is December, the darkest month of the year. The early darkness and long nights provide cover for movements. Burnside will have 3 locations for laying of the pontoon bridges. Just like at Antietam, there will be an upper bridge, a middle bridge, and a lower bridge. The upper bridge will be set near the Chatham estate here, which in the Civil War was known as the Lacey House. The middle bridge will cross into the lower part of town at an old steamboat landing between the railroad shown here and Hazel Run shown here. The lower bridge will cross the river here, below Deep Run. Sumner's right Grand Division is to cross directly over the upper and middle bridges into Fredericksburg. Franklin's left Grand Division is to cross below town onto the lower bridge over a mile down the river. Sumner and Franklin will be geographically divided by Deep Run, shown here in blue. We will zoom into the bridge building sites over the Rappahannock into Fredericksburg and then rotate the map to face west for a better vantage point. The railroad bridge was not standing in December 1862, so we will remove that feature. It's the wee morning hours on December 11th. About 2 in the morning, Union engineers begin laying down the planks for the pontoon bridges. As morning light streams over the landscape, the partially constructed pontoon bridges are spotted, the engineers laying the planks for the pontoon bridge. The Union workers have not gone unnoticed. Barksdale's brigade from McLaw's division has the forwardmost point in the Confederate Army, charged with being the front eyes in Fredericksburg. Barksdale's Mississippians, along with some Floridians from Perry's brigade, have taken positions among the houses. General Lee sends word back to Richmond, noting, at 5 a.m., enemy commenced throwing 3 bridges across river, one at Railroad Bridge, one at Fort Above, and one below mouth of Deep Run. Let's zoom out. While engineer crews build bridges for Sumner's Grand Division to cross into Fredericksburg, engineers are also constructing pontoon bridges at a 3rd site down the river for Franklin's Grand Division. As the crews lay the pontoon bridges in the morning twilight, rebel sharpshooters respond from across the river. The engineers at Franklin's lower bridge receive sporadic fire. There is more success on the crossing at Deep Run. The rebel pickets there do not have houses for cover, and Union artillery blasts them back. By 11 a.m., engineers at Franklin Station have completed the pontoon across the river. But Franklin is ordered to remain in place until the bridges at Fredericksburg are also complete. In town, however, Barksdale sharpshooters are delivering terrible fire to the engineers building the middle and upper pontoon bridges. We will take a closer look at the Fredericksburg crossing zone. The map looks westward into town. Mississippi and Florida sharpshooters are positioned within the houses. The engineers have attempted to lay planks and pontoons, but they scatter from the rifle fire. The bridges are left unfinished. But Burnside will not change course. He will cross at these points. Near the Lacey House, also known as the Chatham House, near the site of the upper bridge, Hall's brigade is moved forward to provide return fire over the river. Below them, on the middle bridge, the 89th New York from Hawkins' brigade returns fire across the river. Then the artillery on Stafford Heights opens up. The town is shelled for 2 hours. The town takes terrible damage, but Barksdale sharpshooters hunker down. Artillery will not drive the rebels from town. It's now afternoon. Burnside will need to be more direct. Boats are prepared for an amphibious landing. Near the Lacey House on the upper crossing, the 7th Michigan sets across the river in boats, followed by the 19th Massachusetts. On the middle bridge, the 89th New York is set into boats. An amphibious landing is made on the Fredericksburg side. The 7th Michigan reaches the shore first, taking fire from the sharpshooters. Then the 19th Massachusetts lands. And just below them, at the site of the middle bridge, the 89th New York lands on the far shore, taking lower Fredericksburg and securing 64 prisoners. Something unique in Civil War battles is happening in this phase of the Battle of Fredericksburg. An amphibious landing is made, followed by block-to-block urban combat. The 7th Michigan secures the first block, taking 31 prisoners. At about 4:30, Barksdale's pickets have been pushed back a block to Caroline Street. With the rebel pickets pushed back, the engineers can return to their work. Soon the bridges are complete, and Hall's brigade is now crossing the bridge, filing into the occupied portion of Fredericksburg along Sophia Street on the river. The December night is already falling, and Burnside wants Howard's division across the bridges. But with Barksdale's sharpshooters still occupying the town, a bottleneck has formed on the upper bridge. Hall's brigade has no choice but to fight street by street through Fredericksburg in the dark to make room for Howard's division. Owen's brigade takes a position on Hall's left. He clears the defenders from that portion of the city. With darkness falling, the remainder of Howard's division crosses into Fredericksburg, and Hawkins' brigade fills in lower Fredericksburg. We will zoom out for a wider view, returning to a north face. Meanwhile, as the Fredericksburg bridges are now completed and secured, with Howard's division crossing into town, Franklin can then begin to cross on the lower bridge below. At 4 p.m., as the sun is already low in the sky, Franklin deploys Devon's brigade from Smith's corps forward. Devon's brigade clears out the rebel pickets from nearby houses as darkness falls. Thus, by the night of December 11th, Howard's division has secured the town of Fredericksburg, and Devon's brigade has secured the lower bridge. On the rebel side, McLaws pulls Barksdale's remaining pickets out of Fredericksburg and back to the stone wall at Mary's Heights. Barksdale is then relieved by Thomas Cobb's brigade of Georgians, who now assume the position at the stone wall in the sunken road. At 6:30 in the evening on December 11th, Burnside telegraphed Washington that his men occupied Fredericksburg with bridges secured over the river. He reports his losses as very slight. At about the same time, Robert E. Lee wired Richmond, his telegraph reading, "Enemy, after cannonading Fredericksburg and demolishing many houses next to the river, succeeded in driving back our sharpshooters and occupying Fredericksburg. They crossed also on their bridge below Deep Run about dusk. We hold the hills around the city." Daybreak, December 12th. The morning light shows blue troops moving over the Rappahannock en masse. Sumner's Grand Division, consisting of Couch and Wilcox's corps, is crossing the upper bridges. Couch's corps holds the town. Wilcox's corps covers the area south of Hazel Run to Deep Run, those streams highlighted here. Below Wilcox, Franklin's Grand Division has crossed the river on the lower bridge south of Deep Run. Hooker's Grand Division will be held on the Falmouth side of the river to support Sumner and Franklin. The giant mass of men will cross each bridge one brigade at a time in order not to overload the pontoon bridges. On the lower landing site, Smith's corps crosses first, followed by Reynolds. Smith will form up parallel to the old Richmond Road, also called the Old Bowling Green Road, highlighted here, while Reynolds will form up to Smith's left, with Reynolds' line extending to the river. By afternoon, Sumner's Grand Division has crossed into Fredericksburg, and Franklin's Grand Division, with Smith's Corps and Reynolds' Corps, has crossed below Deep Run. So two of the three Grand Divisions, Sumner above and Franklin below, are over the river. Hooker's Grand Division remains on the other side of the river, with Butterfield's corps across the river from Fredericksburg near the upper and middle bridges, and Stoneman's corps near the lower bridge, both ready to provide reinforcements where necessary. The afternoon is disrupted here and there by sporadic skirmish shot and artillery. But the Confederates are also moving more men into position on December 12th. Stonewall Jackson's corps is now arriving at Fredericksburg. Lee can discern exactly what is about to proceed, and Jackson's men will relieve Longstreet's stretched line. We will look at a wider vantage point to see the whole rebel line. Jackson will form his corps on Prospect Hill, relieving Hood's division from that sector and hardening the Confederate right. A.P. Hill's division now lines the eastern face of Prospect Hill, and Hood shifts his division up, strengthening the Confederate center. Tolliver's division is also arriving, forming behind A.P. Hill. To remove any confusion with word choice, the Confederates will have a physical stone wall and a metaphorical stone wall at Fredericksburg. The physical stone wall is at the sunken road at the base of Mary's Heights, where McLaw's division stands, while the metaphorical stone wall is General Thomas Stonewall Jackson at Prospect Hill. From his vantage point on the Confederate center, Robert E. Lee notes that during December 12th, houses are being continually burned in the city. As night falls early in the late afternoon on December 12th, Burnside wires Washington that his forces are crossing the river into Fredericksburg without opposition. The grand assembling of armies makes Fredericksburg, Virginia, one of the largest population centers in the United States for the next 3 days. Fredericksburg on December 12th will be essentially tied with Baltimore, Maryland, as the fourth largest population center in the country, with some 200,000 men now assembled in and around this river town. Evening falls on December 12th. Morning, December 13th. With Sumner and Franklin's grand divisions across the Rappahannock, General Burnside is ready to issue his final attack plans for the day. But before Burnside issues his orders for the day's attacks, more of Jackson's corps arrives. Jubal Early and D.H. Hill have made one of the legendary night marches expected in Jackson's corps, arriving from Port Royal downriver. These two divisions establish themselves with Jackson's other divisions on Prospect Hill. Jubal Early forms his division behind A.P. Hill and to the right of Tolliver. D.H. Hill forms up in reserve. Prospect Hill is now a mighty fortress. Burnside's orders are issued to his generals at 8 a.m. Sumner's Grand Division and Franklin's Grand Division are to launch simultaneous strikes on 2 points along the rebel line. We will examine Sumner's sector at Fredericksburg. The map is shifted to face west into town. Sumner is to hold Fredericksburg, with Couch's corps preparing 2 divisions for an assault on Mary's Heights. Hanover Street, shown in white, will be one of the few avenues that leads out of town. That road also has a bridge over the Millrace Canal, that canal shown in blue. Hanover Street leads to Telegraph Road, the sunken road, held by Cobb's brigade, which is now fortified behind a stone wall. This plan will require the attackers to cross some 1,000 yards of open ground between the town and the heights. The canal running the length of the open ground poses an additional hazard, as the men will have to bottleneck themselves over the few bridges going across the water. All the while, Longstreet will have an open range of fire from the heights overlooking the fairgrounds. The only advantage the blue lines will have on their approach is the chilly fog that might mask their movements for some time, but that fog will soon lift away. In the early twilight, Longstreet is at Hood's division at the rebel center right, and through the fog, he hears a voice call out, "Forward, guide center, march!" Hood and Pickett are now alerted that an attack may come on the Confederate right, and that they need to support Jackson on Prospect Hill. Indeed, the Union attack will start on the Confederate right at Prospect Hill. We will zoom into Franklin's Grand Division on the Union left. Just as with the Fredericksburg sector, we will rotate this image to a west-facing perspective. We are now looking west. As with the Fredericksburg zone map, we will obscure some of the modern development on this map to recreate the open fields of 1862. Franklin's Grand Division is organizing in the morning fog. In front of Franklin is a road, shown here in white, which does have a ditch, but Stonewall Jackson is using the forests on Prospect Hill further back to hide his troops. The road, modern Tidewater Trail, is sometimes shown as Bowling Green Road, the Old Richmond Road, the River Road, and the Richmond Stage Road. It is possible that these various names lead to some confusion in Burnside's orders. In all likelihood, Burnside intended for Franklin to hit at the lower ebb of the high ground at the far end of the rebel right, here at Hamilton's Crossing. This would allow for a flanking push on the rebel right. Franklin's attack, however, will unfold at the center of Prospect Hill. Franklin will deploy one corps against the heights. Franklin seems wary of deploying more than the minimum demanded, as he wants enough men in reserve to protect his line of retreat across the bridge. There is always the fear that a sudden, unexpected attack can pin a large body of men against the river. Reynolds' corps on Franklin's left will launch the attack on Stonewall Jackson's position on the forested heights. Just as at Gettysburg, it will be Reynolds here who will be the first into action. General Meade's division is assigned with spearheading the assault, which will be assisted by Gibbon's division on the right. Thus, ironically, here at Fredericksburg, it is General Meade who leads the fateful charge on this day, a Shakespearean twist on the events to transpire in Pennsylvania during the next summer. At 8:30 a.m., General Meade, the old snapping turtle, strikes. Meade moves his division parallel to the river, still with the veil of fog to his benefit, and then makes a sudden right face toward Prospect Hill. But the rebels are ready. Jeb Stuart, posted on the rebel extreme right, perceives through the fog the gathering of troops. He brings Pelham's battery forward. When Meade's troops reach the road, they have yet 1,000 yards of open ground to cover before they reach the slopes. The railroad lines the base of the heights here. If we remove the vegetation, we can see the rise from the flat open ground up to the slopes. Just for reference, the railroad track in front of Prospect Hill is here. A road edges the heights here in purple, running along a portion of the Confederate defenses. The rebel positions on the heights rise over 50 feet from the plain. Here in green, however, lies a marshy zone leading toward the center of the heights. Meade is headed for this point through the marsh. Back at the old Richmond Road, Meade's men clear the fences for artillery to advance. Meade's brigades are set in formation at the road. Jackson's brigade is on the left, Sinclair is on the right, Magilton's brigade is set behind. The artillery is moved up to the road. Every regiment in Meade's division is from Pennsylvania. Sometimes we see the terrible irony of a war between countrymen. Here, there is a Union brigade in Meade's division under Jackson, not to be confused with the Confederate Corps commander Stonewall Jackson, whose men are opposing them on the hill here. It's 10 a.m. The fog is lifting. Jackson's men see the assembled blue lines in their front. A.P. Hill's division is waiting in the woods, his brigades forming two lines. On the upward slope between the railroad and Hillcrest is A.P. Hill's first line. Brockenbrough's brigade is on the extreme rebel right, followed on his left by Archer, then Lane, and Pender. Behind this forward line, on the top of the crest along the road, Gregg fills in the gap between Archer and Lane, while Thomas is behind Lane and Pender. Artillery lines the crest at Brockenbrough's position. A.P. Hill is also reinforced by Jubal Early on the right and Tolliver behind Thomas. D.H. Hill remains in reserve behind Early. The gap between Lane and Archer is that marshy zone, which Meade is now approaching. With Meade now in attack position, Stonewall Jackson's artillery trains on the approaching Bluecoats. Pelham's cannons throw enfilade fire into Meade's left flank. However, Meade positions his batteries near Jackson and returns fire. More Union batteries on the other side of the road are also speaking. Pelham's battery pulls back. However, Meade's attack has been delayed. Reynolds moves Doubleday's division to the left to bolster the left flank. Doubleday moves perpendicular to Meade's line. Now the Union artillery turns to Prospect Hill. Cannonballs from up and down the Union left flank from across the river are thrown into the forest slopes, trying to hit an unseen enemy. Rebel cannon returns fire from Prospect Hill. The Union guns double down. Meanwhile, as the cannons hammer away to and from Prospect Hill, another action is set in motion. We will zoom out to the wider vantage point. At about 11 a.m., Robert E. Lee sees motion in the town of Fredericksburg. Then Union artillery on Stafford Heights trains on Marye's Heights. While Union guns hammer away at Marye's Heights, Lee will not counter the Union artillery. Rather, he decides to save his cannon ammunition for the blue columns that he knows are preparing to assault the heights. From a wider vantage point, by late morning, the whole Union artillery line along Stafford Heights is speaking. At this hour, 2 attacks are now underway. In town, 3 Union divisions from Couch's Corps are assembling to strike Marye's Heights. Meade will now thrust against Prospect Hill. We will zoom back down to Reynolds' front. Below Deep Run, that artillery duel is coming to a conclusion. Jackson has quieted his guns on Prospect Hill. By not responding to the Union artillery, he hides the location and number of his guns. Jackson will save his cannonballs for the infantry. It's now afternoon, and with the guns now silent, Meade advances. Meade's Pennsylvanians still cannot see the position of A.P. Hill's men among the trees. We will zoom in to Prospect Hill to get a better vantage point. Pennsylvania advances, driving back rebel sharpshooters as they approach the railroad. Jackson and Sinclair form the spearhead, pushing through the defenders at the railroad. The rebel artillery waits until the blue lines are nearly point-blank range. When the blue lines are within 800 yards of Walker's batteries, the woods erupts with cannon fire. Walker's artillery on the right punches holes through the attacking lines. Meade's lines waver. Union artillery counterfires. The attackers recover their resolve and press on toward the high ground, moving through the wooded area near the railroad. Union artillery provides enough cover that Meade is able to continue his advance. Jackson's brigade hits Archer's brigade. Sinclair takes heavy fire but advances up the slope, moving through the gap between Archer and Lane. Sinclair advances to the road on the hill crest. Rebels are taken by surprise and 200 prisoners are captured. Let's take a step back at the wider theater. With Franklin in action on the left, and the sounds of musketry and the sight of smoke in the woods on Prospect Hill, Burnside believes the time is right to hit the opposite flank. The attack on Marye's Heights begins. We will zoom in to the town to get a closer look at the attack on Marye's Heights. In town, General Couch is assembling his divisions to make the attack over the open fairgrounds against the sunken road. On the rebel side, Longstreet has McLaw's division at Marye's Heights. On the sunken road, behind the stone wall, is Cobb's Georgian Brigade from McLaw's division. Washington artillery is in support on Marye's Heights. In an eerie replay of recent history, French's division will lead the attack on the sunken road. the same division assigned to lead the attack on another sunken road at Antietam 3 months before. Behind French's division will be Hancock's division. Hancock had assumed command of this division at Antietam after the outfit's commander there, General Richardson, was killed during the attack on the sunken road. These two divisions, French and Hancock, from Sumner's Corps, will strike the sunken road at Fredericksburg in the same order that they struck the sunken road at Antietam, with French in front. We will zoom in to get a closer look at the fairgrounds and Mary's Heights. French's division moves west through town along the city streets that lead out to Telegraph Road, largely following Hanover Street westward towards Mary's Heights. While they move out toward the front, they are hidden by the rise of the bluff leading to the sunken road. French's division crosses the canal and forms into lines, protected here by the bluff in their front. The brigades aligned are Kimball in front, followed by Andrews and Palmer behind. At noon, the order is issued for French to begin the attack. French seems to know his fate. He noted, "The heights to be carried were about 3/4 of a mile outside of the town, crowned by batteries with rifle pits and walls beneath, forming a continuous line of defense. As the blue lines cross into the open fairgrounds, these men have about 1/2 of a mile of open ground to cover to reach their objective. While Hanover Street provides an avenue over the canal, it also essentially funnels the attackers to strike right at the sunken road where it has the stone wall. French's division advances, with one brigade approaching the stone wall at a time. The blue lines crest the bluff, now visible to the rebel defenders. Rebel artillery on Mary's Heights opens up. Longstreet, from his headquarters 1 mile away, can see the cannonballs blowing holes through the Union ranks. Kimball's brigade is raked with fire. Andrews and Palmer fill in the gaps forming within Kimball's line. French describes his lines as they approach the stone wall, saying, "The heads of the columns rushed up to the very walls, melting away before superior numbers in strong position." Arnold's battery is sent forward to support French. The artillery sets up on the end of Prince George Street. However, French's division is shattered, thrown back by artillery and Cobb's brigade. Those that can flee to town do, while much of French's division is left on the field in a suppressed position, huddled behind slopes in the ground, behind the bluff, alongside the wounded or killed. Now Hancock's division comes in, following Hanover and Frederick Streets into the open field, and the conveyor belts of brigades approaching the stone wall continues. Hancock's brigades are Zook in front, Marr's Irish Brigade behind him, and Caldwell in rear. Zook reaches the line of suppressed soldiers from the first attack. Many of Kimball's brigade remain, and Zook and remnants of Kimball's brigade advance together. Hancock's brigades have shifted to the right, supporting French's men there. This wave makes it to within 25 paces of the stone wall, but Cobb's riflemen fire from behind their defenses. Zook's brigade is smashed. Marr's Irish Brigade follows, but the same fate awaits them. Then Caldwell advances, only to be thrown back. The 7th New York and Caldwell's brigade takes among the worst casualties of any Union regiment at Fredericksburg, losing 243 men. Caldwell's New Yorkers had turned the sunken road at Antietam, but here at Fredericksburg they now fall before the sunken road. Caldwell withdraws. Hancock has lost nearly half of his division. French and Hancock's divisions contained highly experienced men and officers that could never be replaced. On the other side, Cobb's brigade, a single brigade with artillery support, has thrown back 2 entire divisions. It's 12:30. Back at Union headquarters on Stafford Heights, Burnside learns that Franklin has not brought up his whole Grand Division to attack. Smoke and wind has obscured his vantage of the action, and he is reliant on couriers for information. While Reynolds' corps was engaged, Smith's corps has not yet committed to the attack. Burnside sends a courier to order Franklin to attack. As French and Hancock falter and stall before the stone wall near Mary's Heights, The fight for Prospect Hill continues. We will move back to the Union left. Meade's Pennsylvanians have found the opening in A.P. Hill's line between Archer and Lane. For a brief moment, at the Battle of Fredericksburg, Pennsylvania cracks through Stonewall Jackson's line. But Archer has stopped Jackson's brigade from advancing, and Sinclair has crested to the hilltop. Magilton takes fire at the railroad and his brigade points right. Sinclair advances along the road at the hillcrest and slams into Gregg's brigade. Gregg is killed and his brigade is shattered. Hamilton is now in command of Gregg's brigade. Meade's Pennsylvanians have reached the slopes, but they need reinforcements. We will take a step back to Franklin's front. Gibbon's division is now in motion to Meade's right, approaching Lane's brigade. Gibbon sends forward Taylor in front. We will zoom back out to the wider front. A third attempt will be made against the stone wall at Mary's Heights. Howard's division is now getting into position. Sturgis's division from Wilcox's corps is also activated to advance with Howard. Burnside is now dipping into his second corps in his third attempt at Mary's Heights. We will zoom into that sector. It's 1 p.m. Howard's division, the last remaining division in Couch's corps, is sent forward like French and Hancock before them. Also, from the left, Sturgis's division is sent in from Wilcox's corps. Soldiers from the earlier Union attacks remain hunkered behind the bluff in the open grounds. Changes have happened on the rebel side as well. Behind the stone wall, Thomas Cobb has died from wounds during the earlier attacks. Thomas Cobb's mother grew up in Fredericksburg, and so he fell on a lane near his mother's childhood house. McMillan takes Cobb's place in command of his Georgia brigade. After holding off 2 divisions, McMillan's brigade is low on ammunition. But Kershaw, also from McLaw's division, adds some fresh South Carolina regiments into McMillan's line. The rebel defenses are now re-strengthened. But Union artillery fires at the movement, and the 3rd South Carolina takes losses, moving into position on the left flank. The 3rd South Carolina sustains the worst casualties of all the regiments holding the sunken road behind the stone wall. Howard's division is assembled, moving toward the stone wall on Hanover Street. In a replay of other failed attacks, they form in line on the fairground. Owen's brigade is in front, with Hall behind. Sully's brigade is held in reserves on the outskirts of town. Owen advances toward the stone wall, but he is thrown back. Then Hall advances, also thrown back. Sully is brought forward to support the faltering attack. Sturgis's division is now up, advancing from Frederick Street. Nagel is on the left, and Ferrero is on the right. Sturgis orders Ferrero to advance his brigade. But rebel artillery and rifle trains on Ferrero's brigade, inflicting terrible destruction. Nagel's brigade is sent forward to the left of Ferrero. Nagel's brigade remains, holding this position through the afternoon. By early afternoon, McMillan's brigade, with support from Kershaw's brigade, has now stopped 4 divisions. The blue line of suppressed attackers remains on the field, hunkering behind the bluff. We will zoom back out and return to the Union left flank. Stonewall Jackson is plugging the hole in his line. Rebel cannon sends Sinclair off the ridgetop. Jubal Early's division is now in motion, which has been waiting in the woods behind A.P. Hill. Brigades under Hoke, Atkinson, and Walker are approaching the front. Magilton's brigade is fanning out toward the right as it ascends the slopes, isolated from the rest of the division. To the right, Gibbon's division is now moving up to the front, advancing over the open farmland. Taylor's brigade is in front and encounters Lane at the railroad. Taylor's left wing is repulsed, but his right remains. Gibbon advances Lyle's brigade, which pushes forward with remnants of Taylor's brigade, but Lane holds at the railroad. Back on Prospect Hill, Archer is breaking. While Archer's left flank is bending, Hoke and Atkinson come to his support, driving Jackson's brigade back. Archer reforms at the railroad, now supported by Early's men. The rebel counterattack is underway. Walker's brigade advances through the swampy gap, driving out the remaining isolated regiments from Magilton and Sinclair. Walker drives to the railroad. Meade's attack is falling apart under Jubal Early's counterattack. Prospect Hill is again under rebel control. About this time, on Gibbon's front, Lyle and Tyler have been repulsed by Lane. But Gibbon will make one last attack against Lane. Root's brigade is called up, and a charge is made over the open ground. Root dislodges Lane from the railroad. Then Thomas's brigade comes to support Lane. Root is flushed back. Gibbon's advance over this open ground, now covered with Union dead and wounded, is awarded the terrible name of Slaughter Pen. 2 Union divisions, Meade and Gibbon, have been repulsed. On the other flank, Atkinson's brigade is pushing forward into the open. However, the Union Army is still massive with plenty of fighting men available. We will zoom out. With Meade and Gibbon now repulsed, Hooker's Grand Division has now been called in for support. Stoneman's Corps is activated. Birney's division is advanced to preserve Franklin's faltering position south of Deep Run. We will zoom back in to the Union left. Atkinson is on the attack. He drives forward into the open, following after Meade's retreating men. But Birney's division passes through Meade's broken lines to face Atkinson. Ward's brigade throws lead at Atkinson. An intense exchange follows. Atkinson is struck down. Birney's division is now up. Ward advances to the right. Robinson forms in the center with Berry on the left. Atkinson pulls back. Birney's division checks the rebel counterattack. Birney's advance may have saved Meade's division from total rout. We will zoom back out. The Union attack on the Confederate left is over. The two sides have returned to their original positions from the morning, with the rebels on the wooded heights and the Federals along the old Richmond or Bowling Green Road. Meade's division has lost some 1,900 men, and Gibbon has lost some 1,300 men. So over 3,000 Union soldiers fall on the failed attack on Prospect Hill and Slaughter Pen. There will be one more action south of Deep Run. Torbert's brigade is sent to secure the railroad south of Deep Run, but Law's brigade from Hood's division advances to meet them. Torbert is pushed back. Law drives forward, moving across the open field. However, at the road he is surprised by Sickles' division from Stoneman's Corps, which has been recently moved forward. Law is thrown back to the railroad. It's about 3 in the afternoon. The remainder of the battle will occur back at the sunken road behind Fredericksburg. We will zoom back into town. McMillan, with support from Kershaw, remains behind the stone wall at the sunken road. A few elements from Sturgis's division and Howard's division remain on the field, while many Union soldiers have remained huddled behind the bluff in the fairgrounds. Burnside is now committing Hooker's Grand Division to attack Mary's Heights. It's 3 o'clock and the December sun will only provide a few more hours of light. General Hooker is convinced this battle is lost, but Burnside wants to keep pushing. Hooker is ordered to move in the reserves from Butterfield's corps. Griffin's division approaches the fairgrounds, relieving Sturgis. They form up into line to renew the attack on the stone wall. Barnes' brigade advances forward, but they are driven back. Then Carroll and Schweitzer advance, who press on to just yards from the stone wall, but the rebels throw a wall of lead into the blue lines. Carroll and Schweitzer pull back. Finally, Stockton's brigade advances, but there is no possible way to crack the rebel defenses. Griffin's attack is over. A 5th Union division has been thrown back from the stone wall. The latest attempt has shed more Union blood and burned more daylight. We will zoom out. By now, Hooker has advanced his Central Grand Division, composed of Stoneman's Corps and Butterfield's Corps. Stoneman's Corps is over the Rappahannock, whose units have already relieved and assisted attacks on both sides of Deep Run. Butterfield has deployed 1 division, Griffin, but he still has 2 unused divisions, Humphreys and Sykes. In the late afternoon, there is much confusion about the situation at the front. Smoke from both fronts has obscured Burnside's view of the action, and Burnside is receiving mixed reports, including a claim that Mary's Heights is about to be taken, and perhaps one more push will do it. Burnside has not brought the Army of the Potomac to Fredericksburg to be stopped. He will make another strike for Marye's Heights. However, Hooker remains convinced that any further action is folly. He pleads Burnside to reconsider, but Burnside commands another action. We will zoom back into the Sunken Road sector. Hooker draws artillery forward. The artillery trains on the rebel defenses. The barrage continues until near sunset. Hazard's battery is brought over the canal on Hanover Street. It sets up there among the suppressed fighters from earlier that day. They fire on the rebel stronghold. The Confederate artillery on Marye's Heights is out of ammunition, but the entrenched defenders hold tight. The defenders, though, have made preparations for renewed attacks. The Washington artillery, which had fired on the attackers all day at Marye's Heights, is replaced by Alexander's battalion. Now Hooker is required to prepare his two last divisions, Humphreys and Sykes, from Butterfield's corps for the final assault on Marye's Heights. The plan is to have Humphreys take the lead, hitting the rebel left, with Sykes following in echelon on his right for support. At 4 p.m., Humphreys is in position on Hanover Street in a redo of so many other attacks from that day. There is about 1 hour of daylight left. Humphreys' division follows up Hanover Street to Telegraph Road. Howard's remaining men, who have been in position for hours, are now relieved. In front of Humphreys' division is Allebach's brigade, which pulls off the road to the left, followed by Tyler's brigade, which exits the road to the right. Allebach reaches the point occupied by men from Couch's corps, who had remained there all day, suppressed at the front behind the bluff. Allebach's men take cover behind the rise in the ground and fire on the stone wall. Humphreys sees that it is futile to fire from a suppressed position against an entrenched enemy. The sun's light is disappearing with each minute. He will have Allebach charge the defenses, while Tyler is still preparing his brigade. Allebach charges. As the men rise up the slope toward the stone wall, rifle sounds from the stone wall. Allebach doesn't make it 50 yards before the charge falters back to the ravine. It's getting dark. Humphreys receives orders that the heights must be taken before nightfall. Tyler is moved over to the other side of Hanover Street, reaching the line of suppressed men in the field. Many of the men hunkered on the hill have seen several failed attacks already. The men lying on the field call out to Tyler's brigade, begging them not to advance. Some of the men from previous attacks try to stop Tyler's men. But Tyler presses his men forward. The stone wall erupts again with rifle fire. But Tyler's brigade presses on, nearing the stone wall, all the while losing men. For a moment, Tyler's line returns fire, then melts back to the embankment. Sykes' division, which is now coming up from the town, is recalled from the attack, sparing any further needless loss of life. Sykes' men help to cover Humphreys' withdrawal, and they occupy the ravine. It's pitch dark at 5 p.m., but there will be one more attempt at the stone wall. Getty's division assembles to hit the stone wall from the left. Hawkins' brigade, which contains some of the outfits that secured Fredericksburg on December 11, will lead this attack. They are followed by Harlan's brigade, which takes position along the railroad. The Union line advances, taking fire. Hawkins leads, followed by Harlan. It is too dark and the situation is too confused for Getty to make any impact. The division withdraws. In the darkness, in front of the stone wall, lay thousands of Union dead and wounded. Burnside calls off further attacks. During the day, General Lee had faced Longstreet and said, "It is well this is so terrible. We should grow too fond of it." At 9 p.m., Lee wires Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon that he expects the attack to begin anew at morning light. Later that night, on the other side of the river, at 4 a.m. on December 14, Burnside wires President Lincoln, saying, "Our troops are all over the river. We hold the first ridge outside the town and 3 miles below. We hope to carry the crest today. Our loss is heavy, say 5,000. The Army of the Potomac remains on the western side of the Rappahannock through the night. Burnside hopes his presence will force Robert E. Lee to move out of his defensive position on the heights and attack. However, Lee will not take the bait. Dawn light on December 14 reveals the many Union dead and wounded between the canal and the sunken road. Most of the Union attackers did not make it to within 100 yards of the stone wall. Burnside contemplates another thrust at the heights, but his lieutenants convince him not to attack again. This time, Burnside listens, realizing that any further action will result in needless loss. Before the evacuation, a flag of truce is called. The wounded are collected. Union wounded are returned across the bridge for medical care, and the dead are gathered and buried. December 14th quietly slips away. Morning, December 15th. The rebels sense Burnside's bluff, and their cannons speak. With Lee holding the high ground and another Union attack not feasible, Burnside has no choice but to retreat. It's 6 p.m. Under the cover of darkness, Burnside moves the Army of the Potomac back across the pontoon bridges to the other side of the Rappahannock River. At 4 a.m. on December 16, Burnside sends a telegraph to Major General Halleck that he has withdrawn. Some hours later, after the sun had revealed the landscape, General Lee wires the Confederate Secretary of War, stating, "As far as can be ascertained this stormy morning, the enemy has disappeared in our immediate front, and he has recrossed the Rappahannock." Confederate skirmishers fill back into town, where they had been 5 days before. The Battle of Fredericksburg is over. History had repeated itself for Burnside, who had only 3 months ago fought his way over a bridge at Antietam Creek, thrown his corps forward, only to be driven back. Now this same story played out at large, with the whole Union Army of the Potomac at Fredericksburg. Robert E. Lee reports that he has secured 900 prisoners and 9,000 captured arms, as well as large stores of ammunition in evacuated Fredericksburg. It is a total Confederate victory. Following the disaster at Fredericksburg, President Abraham Lincoln is now facing his greatest political challenge.